Hi, Happy Hippos. I have another story for you today about Halloween and a Halloween pumpkin. Look at this. This is a pumpkin. Would you say that this is a big pumpkin or a little pumpkin? Well, I can hold it in my hand, in just one hand. I don't need to hold it with two hands. It's not that heavy. So I would say this is a small pumpkin. It's pretty little. But the story is about the biggest pumpkin ever. The biggest pumpkin ever. Not only is it a big pumpkin, but it's the biggest pumpkin that you will ever see. The biggest pumpkin ever. Once there were two mice who fell in love with the same pumpkin. Can you see the pumpkin in the pumpkin patch? It's not orange yet, it's still green. Right there. Clayton the house mouse noticed it one day in the vegetable garden. It was still little and green, but Clayton thought he could make it grow really big. It might even get big enough to win the grand prize at the town pumpkin contest. Desmond, the field mouse, discovered the pumpkin the same day. He thought that if he helped it grow, it could become the biggest jack-o'-lantern in the neighborhood. That afternoon, Clayton watered the pumpkin. He also mixed up some fertilizer of manure and water. He spread the mixture around the pumpkin to make it grow larger. That very same night, Desmond went into the garden. He watered the pumpkin too. He also spread some manure mixed with water around it. So both mice are giving the pumpkin something that it needs to grow really big. They're giving it water and they're giving it food. The next day, Clayton watered and fertilized the pumpkin again. The next night, Desmond did the same, and the pumpkin began to grow. By the end of a month, the pumpkin was so large, Clayton couldn't believe his eyes. "My goodness," said Clayton's mother, "and it's not even full grown." Clayton shrugged. "All I do is water it," he said. Clayton's mother whispered in his ear, "If you want to grow the pumpkin bigger and faster, you should use sugar water." That night, Desmond brought his brother Morris to see the pumpkin. Morris knew everything there was to know about growing things. "That's some pumpkin," he said. Desmond shrugged. "All I do is water it," he said. Morris whispered in his ear. "You should try using sugar water," he said. That's funny. Clayton and Desmond are doing the same thing to the pumpkin, and they said the same thing. They both said, "All I do is water it." And then Clayton's mom and Desmond's brother, they said the same thing. Now they really know how to make pumpkins grow big. The next day, Clayton dug a small hole beside the pumpkin vine. In the hole, he placed a bowl full of sugar water. He cut into the vine a few inches from the pumpkin. In the cut, he put one end of a piece of candle wick. Then he put the other end in the bowl of sugar water. That night, on the other side of the pumpkin, Desmond did exactly the same thing. Within a week, the pumpkin was twice the size it had been. Within 2 weeks, it was absolutely enormous. You know what I noticed about this picture that I think is kind of silly? This is Desmond, right, with his sugar water at nighttime. But this is the sugar water that Clayton put there in the daytime. I don't think either mouse even walked around the pumpkin to look at the whole thing. Desmond's just taking care of this side, and Clayton's just taking care of this side, and they don't even know that the other mouse is doing anything. They're silly mice. Ooh, look at all these pumpkin stickers. Clayton was amazed. He ran down the road and peeked into his friend Jimmy's pumpkin patch. The pumpkin Jimmy was growing for the contest looked much smaller. Clayton scratched his head. "I have an amazing pumpkin," he said out loud, "and I think I'm going to win the contest." That night, Desmond and his brother Morris spent a long time looking at the pumpkin. "How do you think it got that big?" Desmond asked. Morris shrugged. "A little luck, a little skill." "It's going to make some jack-o'-lantern," said Desmond. "It sure is," said Morris. A week later, Clayton noticed the pumpkin was bigger than the family car. During the day, everyone he knew came by to admire it. And at night, all the field mice gathered round to do the same. By now, summer was almost over. In a week, the pumpkin would be full grown and start turning yellowish and then orange. A few weeks after that, it would be ripe and ready for the pumpkin contest. Clayton could hardly wait. The pumpkin was growing so fast it would soon be larger than his house. Then he had a terrible thought. If the pumpkin was so big, how would he get it to the contest? It wouldn't fit in his red wagon. It wouldn't even fit in a truck. Clayton decided to worry about this when the time came. "How would you move that big pumpkin? That thing is enormous. It is almost the size of that house. Do you think you could move something that's as big as a house?" "I don't know. A pumpkin is round. Maybe they could roll it. But it's pretty big. You still need some muscles to be able to roll something like that." That night, the weather grew colder. Thinking there might be an early frost, Clayton rushed out to the pumpkin with his blanket. One was not enough. Soon he was rushing back and forth, carrying all the blankets from the house. As he worked, he hummed a little song. And as he hummed, he heard someone else singing. He also began to realize that someone else was covering the pumpkin with blankets. Desmond, too, had seen the danger of an early frost. He, too, had brought blankets for the pumpkin. And as he worked, he sang a little song. And as he sang, he began to realize that someone else was working and humming. Now, these mice finally realize that they're not the only one helping this pumpkin grow really big. Clayton stopped humming. He put down his pile of blankets and peered around the corner of the pumpkin. Desmond stopped singing. He put down his blankets and peered around the corner of the pumpkin. The two of them bumped heads and fell down. "You've been feeding the pumpkin," said Clayton. "You've been feeding the pumpkin," said Desmond. "That's why it got so big," said Clayton. "That's why it got so big," said Desmond. They burst out laughing. They were working together like a team, and they didn't even realize it. But it seems like they were happy that the pumpkin had all that help. When everything had been explained, Clayton said, "I know I'll win the contest if I can get the pumpkin to town." Desmond smiled. "I'll help you. Just let me carve the pumpkin into a jack-o'-lantern for Halloween when the contest is over." "It's a deal," said Clayton. "A deal," said Desmond, and they shook on it. They shook hands. That means that what they talked about, they agree to, and they both think it's a good idea, so they shook hands. The morning of the contest was bright and sunny. Mice were bringing their pumpkins to the town square by truck and car and wagon. Some were rolling them along the ground. Oh, that's what I thought. That's how I thought they might get their pumpkin to the contest. Looks like other mice were doing the same thing. Suddenly, they all stopped short. Over the fields came the biggest pumpkin anyone had ever seen. It was being pulled by 100 field mice on motorcycles. Have you ever seen a mouse riding a motorcycle? I've never seen a mouse ride a motorcycle. But there they are. They all have their helmets on to keep their heads safe. They must be really, really going fast. All that dust that they're making in the air. And look at that. There's Clayton and Desmond riding on top of that giant pumpkin. When the pumpkin reached town, it was too big for any of the streets. Clayton had to explain why they couldn't bring it to the square. The mayor understood at once. He led the crowd to the giant pumpkin and pinned the first prize ribbon on its side. Then everyone danced around it. "Who would have believed this?" said Clayton as he danced. "Who would have believed this?" said Desmond at the same moment. When the celebration was over, the 100 field mice pulled the pumpkin back to the field. The day before Halloween, they carved it into the best jack-o'-lantern ever. And on Halloween night, its wonderful, smiling face could be seen glowing for miles around. And that is the end. In real life, I don't think I've ever seen a pumpkin as big as the pumpkin that Clayton and Desmond were taking care of. A pumpkin as big as a house? I don't know about that. Usually they're kind of small, like this one. Have a wonderful day, Happy Hippos. Bye.